Up until now, we've been writing all of our code inside of these root closures, and that's fine for really, really small things, but as your application grows, you don't want to end up with a huge list of logic inside of your web routes. So we're going to switch things over now, and in fact, we're going to switch these two things over to controllers, and we're going to see a couple of ways that we can achieve this. So first of all, of course, with Artisan, we know if we come up to the make section here, we can make a controller. So we can either create these out manually or using Artisan. And pretty much always you're going to use Artisan. So let's go ahead and run PHP Artisan make controller. And let's use the help flag again just to see what we need to do. So the only argument we need to pass in here is the name of the class. We're not going to use any of these options just yet. So let's go ahead and make a post controller. Now you can give these any name you want, but typically what you will do is give the name of the thing that you are responding to, and then you will add a suffix on the end of controller. Okay, so now that we've created that, let's head over and look inside of our app directory under HTTP and controllers, and sure enough, that post controller has been created. And what Artisan has done is it's created this post controller out with pretty much everything we need to get started. It's created a class, it's extending Laravel's base controller, which we'll take a look at later, and now we just need to fill in the methods in here that respond to our routes. So how do we do this? Well, we've got two pages here. We've got an index, which we've already kind of established that's the name for, and we've got a kind of show page, which shows an individual post. So let's create out a method for the index just first of all. So let's create this out here, and just for now, let's go ahead and just dump something out to the page. We've not spoken about this yet, but within Laravel, we have a couple of ways that we can dump things out. We can either use dump on its own, which is a Symfony var dumper function, and that will just dump something to the page. So I can just say hello, just inside of here. Or we can use the die dump function, which will kill the page, not allow anything underneath to be run, and that's useful for when you're debugging and you want to stop the flow of what you're doing. Let's just use die dump for now. We'll revisit this in a minute. Okay, so what we want to do is hook up this post's route to that controller. How do we do that? Let's get rid of this code for now. So I'm just going to cut this out and just comment it out up here. And let's replace this closure in here with an array. Now, there's a couple of ways that you can provide the controller in here and the method that you want to invoke, but usually, particularly with Laravel 8, we would do this within an array. So the first thing we want to do is tell the route which controller we actually want to use, and this is the post controller. Now within PHP, we can use the scope resolution operator, which is 2 colons, and class to get the fully qualified class name to the class that we're working with. In this case, it's post controller. What we don't really want to do is have to say app, HTTP controllers, all that kind of stuff. And we'll talk about namespacing in just a minute if you are very new. Okay, so to get this working, we're going to have to import this class at the top. Now, your text editor might not have that functionality, but all you need to do is make sure you provide a use statement at the top here with the path to this controller. And like I said, we'll talk about this path in just a second. Okay, so the second thing that we want to pass through to this array is the method that we want to use, and we already know we have called that index. So we're going to just pass in index into there. And that's all we need to do to convert that over to use a controller rather than a closure. Let's go over to the browser and go over to the posts page, and sure enough, you can see we get dumped out with hello. And that looks like that just because we're using that DD function, which is effectively the same as the dump function, as you can see, but it just kills the execution of the script. Okay, now just before we move on, we've just introduced a new concept here which you may not be familiar with. If you've worked with PHP for a while, you'll understand namespaces, but if you don't understand namespaces, this is a quick rundown. So we have an app directory just here, which has a name of app. We'll take a look at where that's defined in a minute. We're effectively saying namespace this under this directory structure. So we've got HTTP, we know that this is the next directory down, and then we've got controllers. This just helps you organize things within namespaces so class names don't clash, and you'll find these throughout all of your app directory. Now the reason that this is namespace under app, if we just come down to our composer file, you can see we're auto loading in our files here. So we're using the PSR4 standard, which just basically dictates how this is loaded in. This is the name of our app namespace, which you can change if you want to, but I'd recommend just leaving this as app. And it's saying, well, auto load everything from the app directory, and that's how we end up with this post controller being under this particular namespace. So we've declared it here and we're using it here. It just basically helps to keep all of your classes in an organized area. Okay, so let's go ahead and leave that for now. We do have a course on namespaces if you want to dive into them a little bit more deeply, but we want to take the code that we took here and we want to cut that out and pop it inside of the post controller. Now we've moved this over to a controller, but this is going to work in exactly the same way. We're using this view function. Again, we don't need to go back into another directory. We can just use this view function on its own. We've defined out the list of posts in here. We're returning a view, and this should work in exactly the same way. The only difference now is we have all of our code tucked away in a controller dedicated to showing our posts. Okay, so what happens if we want to move this route over as well to also use a controller? Do we need to create a new controller? Well, you can do that if you want to. You could have a post show controller, which again just had a simple method and you could just follow the same structure. But we can have multiple methods inside of a controller. It really depends on what you're building and how you want to structure things. But normally what you would do for a post controller, if you're building some kind of RESTful website or API out, you would have an index method to list posts, you would have a show method to show posts, and so on. And these can all go in the same controller. So let's take the code that we used here and let's put that inside of a, you guessed it, show method. And let's go ahead and return that view in here. Now we need to figure out the ID in just a minute, but let's switch this over to use that controller. So I'm going to go ahead and say post controller once again. We don't need to re-import that because the namespace is already in there at the top. And we're just going to reference a different method. And that's made things a lot tidier. You can see here that we've just got two lines here which both reference this post controller. Now our methods within our controllers work very similarly to our root closures in the sense that we can still accept in the ID that we saw before. So all we need to do is just put that ID inside of the method just inside of here. So let's come over to /1 and sure enough you can see we get exactly the same result. Now, just before we go on, let's go ahead and take a look at PHP Artisan root list. What that's going to do now is show you a slightly different action to what we saw before. Remember, these were closures before. Now we're getting the full namespace to the controller and the method that we're using as well. So if you do need to kind of find out where a route is going really quickly, you can just head over to the Artisan console, run PHP Artisan root list, and you're good to go. You can pretty much see everything that is happening. Now I'm going to create one more route here just to show you how we can use controllers without names. This is something that you might come across, and it's a very popular concept to separate out controllers to only do one thing. So I'm going to go ahead and cover this really quickly. Let's go ahead and run PHP Artisan make controller again, and let's make out a home controller, which is probably something we would want to do. You might have things that you want to display on the home page, and this might be better suited to a home controller. Let's go ahead and create out a route in here for our home page, so /, and let's go ahead and reference the home controller just inside of here, like so. Now let's say we didn't really want to give this a name. Home controller index would be fine. So let's just go ahead and do that really quickly and just return a string from here. We don't actually need to do anything in here for now. But we'd have to give this an index name. So if we come over to the home page, you can see that we do get home out. But let's say we didn't want to include our index. Well, if we get rid of that and give that a refresh, we get a reflection exception, function does not exist. If we come over to the home controller and name this invoke, what that's going to do is use the PHP magic method invoke to actually invoke this home controller and not allow us or not need for us to give a name out for this. Now it still doesn't quite work because we just need to change this around to get rid of the array. The array is assuming that you are trying to call something on a particular controller. Let's give that a refresh, and sure enough, we get home out. So that's worked in exactly the same way, but this time we have not needed to give this a name. And you'll probably find that as you're building things, you'll have controllers like this that do one thing, but you don't necessarily need to give a method name. So using the PHP Magic invoke method is a good idea in this case. Okay, so we have moved our two routes here over to controllers. What we're going to do now though is look at posting forms, which is another massive part of building out an application, and we're going to utilize the post controller to allow us to do this.